steady ticking of the kitchen clock. Margaret stood by the stove stirring a pot of vegetable soup. The scent of thyme and garlic filled her small house in Portland, blending with the sound of soft rain outside. It was one of those calm mornings she had learned to love after years of noise, laughter, and chaos. Now, at 65, her days passed quietly. Life had slowed since Thomas, her husband of 40 years, passed away. She had learned to live with the silence, though it never felt natural. Sometimes she still set out 2 plates at dinner, only to remind herself she was alone. Her friends called often, her daughter visited once a month, but loneliness was a quiet guest that never left. She had just started chopping bread when she heard it. A sudden knock on the front door. At first, she thought she imagined it. But then it came again. 3 knocks, hesitant, uncertain. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart picking up pace. It was unusual for anyone to visit her unannounced, especially on a rainy morning. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. "Ethan," she whispered. Her 22-year-old grandson stood there, drenched from head to toe. His brown hair clung to his forehead, and his clothes were soaked. He looked exhausted, his eyes swollen from lack of sleep, or maybe from crying, Grandma. He said quietly, his voice trembling, "Can I come in?" Margaret didn't hesitate. She stepped aside and pulled him into the warmth of the house. "Of course, sweetheart. What are you doing out here in the rain?" He shook his head, water dripping from his jacket. I needed somewhere to go." She guided him toward the kitchen, handed him a towel, and poured him a mug of hot cocoa, the way she used to when he was little. As he wrapped his hands around the warm cup, she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze stayed fixed on the table. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Margaret sat across from him. "Talk to me, Ethan. What happened?" He stayed silent for a long time. The clock ticked, the rain fell harder, and the air between them filled with worry. Finally, he spoke. "I left school, Grandma. I just walked out one day. I couldn't do it anymore." Her eyes softened. "You dropped out." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, and my dad's furious. He said I embarrassed the family. Mom tried to defend me, but they've been fighting ever since." He took a shaky breath. "I didn't know where else to go." Margaret's heart ached. She knew how harsh her son, Ethan's father, could be when angry. He was a good man, but stubborn and proud, just like his late father. "You did the right thing by coming here," she said gently. "You'll always have a place with me." Ethan gave a weak smile. "I didn't want to bother you. I know it's been hard for you too." Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand. "You could never bother me, Ethan. You're family. And we all make mistakes. It's how we learn." For the first time that morning, his shoulders relaxed. He looked around the kitchen, his gaze landing on the framed photographs lining the shelf. Pictures of happier times. "I used to love this house," he said quietly. "Everything felt safe here." "It still is," she said softly. "Nothing's changed." But something had changed in both of them. Margaret saw it in his tired eyes, and Ethan saw it in the faint sadness behind her smile. As the rain continued outside, Ethan began to talk. He told her how college had drained him, how he'd lost interest in his studies, how the pressure from his father became unbearable. He had worked part-time, struggled to pay rent, and slowly felt like he was drowning. "I thought leaving school would help," he said, "but it only made things worse. Dad said I ruined everything." Margaret listened without interrupting. She didn't need to offer advice, not yet. Sometimes people needed to speak before they could hear anything in return. Finally, she said, "You didn't ruin anything, Ethan. You're young. You still have time to figure out your path. Life isn't a straight line. It bends. It surprises you." He looked at her as if hearing that for the first time. "You really think so?" She smiled. "I know so." He smiled back faintly. "Thanks, Grandma." They sat together for a long time, the silence now peaceful. Margaret served him soup, and they ate slowly, the warmth filling both their bodies and their hearts. As the day went on, she showed him the garden, the small improvements she'd made, the flowers Thomas once planted that still bloomed every spring. Ethan listened, nodding, his expression softening. But as night fell, Margaret began to sense something else in his behavior, a heaviness that hadn't lifted. He was polite and gentle, but his mind seemed far away. She found him staring at the old family photo in the hallway, the one taken 10 years ago at a family barbecue. His mother and father stood on either side of him, smiling. Thomas had been alive then, holding Margaret's hand. Everyone looked happy. Ethan stared at that photo for a long time. Grandpa looked so strong, he murmured. He was, Margaret said. He believed that no matter how bad things got, you never stopped trying. Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. I wish I had his strength. You do, she said. You just don't see it yet. He turned to her suddenly, his eyes glistening. You still miss him, don't you? Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Every day. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them heavy with unspoken memories. Later that evening, after dinner, Ethan insisted on cleaning up. Margaret smiled, watching him quietly. There was something comforting about having another person in the house again. The sound of footsteps, the clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversation. It reminded her of how life used to be before everything grew quiet. When it was time to sleep, she showed him to the guest room, Thomas's old study. Now converted with a bed and small dresser. You'll be comfortable here, she said. Ethan nodded, his voice low. Thanks for taking me in, Grandma. I really needed this. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't need to thank me. You belong here. Rest now. She went to her room, changed into her nightgown, and turned off the lamp. But sleep didn't come easily. She kept thinking about Ethan's expression, about how lost he looked. There was something more behind his words, something he hadn't told her. Sometime past midnight, she heard soft footsteps outside her room. The floor creaked, and she sat up, listening. The sound stopped, then resumed faintly, leading toward the kitchen. Concerned, she got out of bed and walked down the hallway. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the same photograph again. His hands were gripping the edge of the table, his face pale under the dim light. Ethan, she said softly. He startled, quickly wiping his eyes. Sorry, Grandma. I didn't mean to wake you. She walked closer. You didn't. What's wrong? He looked away. I just couldn't sleep. Everything's heavy. I keep thinking about what I did, what I said to Dad before I left. I said awful things. Margaret sat beside him, her voice calm. You can't change the past, Ethan, but you can choose what you do next. Regret can destroy you if you let it. Forgive yourself first. He nodded slowly. You always know what to say. Margaret smiled gently. That's what grandmothers are for. The air felt warmer then, softer. Ethan finally relaxed, leaning back in his chair. I'll fix it somehow. I'll call him tomorrow. That's a good start, she said, patting his hand. Now go rest. He stood, hesitated, then hugged her tightly. It surprised her, the strength in his arms, the need in that gesture. Thank you, Grandma, he whispered, for still believing in me. Tears welled in her eyes. Always, my dear, always. As he walked back to his room, Margaret sat for a moment in silence, the old photos still glowing faintly in the soft light. The house no longer felt empty. The loneliness she had carried for years had cracked open just enough to let in something new. Love, hope, and the start of healing. But deep in her heart, she sensed that Ethan's visit carried more meaning than he had shared. Something told her this was not just a reunion. It was the beginning of a truth she wasn't ready for, one that would soon shake her quiet world once again. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the sky pale and gray. Margaret woke early, the way she always did. Years of routine had made her mornings sacred coffee, a light breakfast, then tending to the small garden Thomas had loved. But that morning felt different. The air was heavy with something unspoken. Ethan was still asleep, his shoes by the door, his jacket drying by the heater. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. She poured herself a cup of coffee and looked out the kitchen window. The world seemed still. Only the soft rustle of the trees and the distant chirping of birds filled the air. She thought about Ethan, how broken he looked last night, how much pain he carried but refused to show. She knew that kind of pain too well. When Ethan woke, it was almost noon. He looked a little better, though his eyes still carried the weight of his troubles. "Morning, Grandma," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "Morning, sweetheart." "I made pancakes," she said, trying to sound cheerful. He smiled faintly, sitting down. "You still remember how I like them?" "Of course," she said with a wink. "I never forget." For a while, they talked about small things, his old dog, her neighbor's noisy cat, the state of her car that hadn't been driven much since Thomas passed. But beneath the light conversation, there was an unspoken tension. Margaret could tell Ethan was hiding something deeper. After breakfast, she went to clean up while he sat quietly by the window. Then she noticed something strange. Ethan kept glancing toward the hallway, almost nervously. She didn't say anything, pretending not to notice. But later, when she went to his room to bring clean towels, she saw a small, worn-out envelope lying on the nightstand. It looked old. With her handwriting on it, her heart froze. It was a letter she hadn't seen in years, a letter she had written to Thomas before his surgery. The one she thought had been lost. She had poured everything into that letter, her fears, her regrets, and her love. Why was it in Ethan's possession? She stood there for a moment, confused. Then Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Grandma," he said softly, "I can explain." She held up the letter. "Ethan, where did you find this?" He took a deep breath. "Dad had it. I saw him reading it one night a few months ago. I didn't mean to take it, but when he started yelling about how you never told him everything, He stopped, struggling for words. "I just wanted to understand." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, the letter trembling in her hand. "Understand what?" Ethan's eyes were full of guilt. "He said there were secrets between you and Grandpa, things you never told him. He said you weren't always honest with him." Her chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" "He said Grandpa might not have been his real father," Ethan whispered. The words hit her like a storm. She felt dizzy, her breath catching in her throat. "That's not true," she said, her voice trembling. "Your grandfather loved your father more than anything in this world." Ethan nodded. "I know, but Dad doesn't believe it. He said he found this letter and thought it was proof. I took it because I didn't want him to destroy it." Margaret clutched the letter to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. "He misunderstood, Ethan. That letter was written when your grandfather was in the hospital. I was scared, terrified I would lose him. I told him things I'd never said aloud about the fights, the doubts, even the mistakes I made when I was young. But none of it changes the truth. Thomas was the love of my life." Ethan looked down, shame covering his face. "I shouldn't have brought it up. I just thought maybe if I knew the truth, I could fix things between Dad and you." She reached out, touching his hand. "You did nothing wrong." "But your father. He's been angry for years. Losing his father, the pressure of work, and now you leaving school, it's all too much for him." Ethan sighed. "He's not the man he used to be. Sometimes I think he hates himself." Margaret looked out the window. Maybe he just doesn't know how to forgive. The rest of the day passed slowly. Ethan helped her in the garden, pulling weeds and trimming the rose bushes. It was quiet work, peaceful even, but both of them were lost in their thoughts. As they worked, Margaret thought back to her younger days, too, when Thomas was alive and their son Daniel was just a boy. He had been stubborn even then, but with a good heart. Later that evening, Margaret decided to tell Ethan the truth, the full truth, something she had buried for decades. They sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating their faces. "When I was your age," she began, "I made choices I wasn't proud of. I met Thomas when I was working at a diner in Seattle. He was kind, funny, and steady, everything I needed. But before him, I was engaged to someone else. His name was Paul. We ended things badly, and when I found out I was pregnant soon after, I didn't know what to do." Ethan stared at her, frozen. "You mean, Dad might be?" She raised a hand gently. "No, Ethan. He is Thomas's son. I told Thomas everything before we married. He promised to love us both no matter what. That's the kind of man he was. But when Daniel found that old letter, he must have read my words out of context. I was writing about my guilt, not a secret affair. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. He's been carrying that misunderstanding all this time. Yes, she whispered, and I've been too afraid to bring it up. We drifted apart after your grandfather passed. Every time I tried to talk to him, he shut me out. Ethan's voice cracked. That's why he's so angry. He thinks his whole life was a lie. Margaret nodded slowly, and I let him think that. They sat in silence for a while. The weight of years pressed between them. Finally, Ethan spoke. Then maybe it's not too late to fix it. I'll talk to him. I'll tell him what really happened. She smiled faintly. You'd do that? Of course, he said. He listens to me sometimes, even when he pretends he doesn't. Margaret took his hand. Then promise me this. Ethan, tell him I never stopped loving him, no matter what he believes. I will, he said. I promise. As the night deepened, Margaret felt something shift inside her, a release she hadn't felt in years. Maybe this was why Ethan had come. Maybe his visit wasn't an accident. Maybe fate had brought him here to mend what was broken. But just as peace began to settle, something unexpected happened. The doorbell rang loud and sudden, breaking the silence. Margaret froze, her heart skipping. She wasn't expecting anyone. Ethan stood up. I'll get it. He walked to the door and opened it, and there stood Daniel, his face stern and tired. Rainwater dripped from his coat, his eyes locked on his son. Dad? Ethan whispered. Daniel's gaze moved past him, landing on Margaret. His voice was low but cold. We need to talk. The air grew heavy again. Margaret's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She hadn't seen her son in months, not since their last argument about Thomas's will. She could see the resentment still burning in his eyes. Ethan stepped aside. Dad, please. Don't, Daniel cut him off. I know why you came here, Ethan. You wanted to hear her version, didn't you? Her story. Margaret stood, trembling slightly. Daniel, please come in. Let's talk calmly. He stepped inside, his jaw tight. Calmly. After all these years, you still think you can fix things with words? Ethan tried to intervene, but Daniel raised a hand. Not now, son. He turned back to his mother. I found the letter missing. I knew Ethan took it. So tell me, Mom, are you finally ready to tell me the truth? Margaret took a deep breath, steadying her voice. Yes, Daniel, I am. The rain started again outside, tapping softly on the windows. In that moment, 3 generations stood under the same roof. A grandmother clinging to her past. A son trapped in anger. And a grandson desperate to bring them together. Margaret knew this conversation could break them, or finally heal them. But she was done running from the truth. And as she looked into her son's weary eyes, she whispered, It's time you know everything. The rain outside grew heavier, echoing against the windows as if the sky itself knew what was about to unfold. The air inside the small kitchen was thick with tension. Margaret stood near the table, her hands trembling slightly. While Daniel stood across from her, his jaw set, eyes full of years of anger and hurt. Ethan stood between them, torn, his heart pounding. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock and the rain beating down outside. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. Her voice was calm but fragile, carrying the weight of decades. Daniel, she said, you deserve to know everything. No more hiding, no more fear. Daniel crossed his arms, his expression guarded. I've heard enough lies to last a lifetime, Mom. So go on. Tell me what you think I should believe now. Ethan took a step forward, but Margaret raised a gentle hand. It's all right, Ethan. Let me speak. She took a deep breath, gathering her strength. That letter you found years ago. It wasn't what you thought. I never betrayed your father. I loved him with all my heart. Every word I wrote in that letter was out of fear, not guilt. Daniel frowned. Fear of what? Margaret's eyes softened. Of losing him. Of losing everything. when your father was in the hospital before his surgery. I wrote that letter because I couldn't bear the thought of saying those words aloud. I wrote about the mistakes I made in my youth, about the choices that scared me, about how much I regretted not being honest about my past. But I never lied to your father. He knew everything before we married. Daniel's jaw tightened. You expect me to believe that? Ethan stepped in. Dad, please. I've read the letter too. You misunderstood it. Grandma didn't do what you think she did. Daniel turned sharply toward his son. You have no idea what that letter did to me, Ethan. All my life I thought my parents had the perfect marriage. Then one night I find this old letter hidden away. Words about another man, about guilt, about a past she never told me. It shattered everything I believed. His voice cracked slightly. I felt like I didn't even know who I was anymore. Margaret walked closer, her eyes full of pain. Daniel, I never wanted you to carry that burden. That letter wasn't meant for you. It was meant for your father, a way for me to let go of the fear that haunted me. I was scared that love wouldn't be enough. But your father, he proved me wrong every day we were together. For a moment, Daniel's anger flickered. He looked at her, searching for something, maybe truth, maybe comfort. Then why didn't you tell me all this before? Why did you let me think the worst? Tears filled her eyes. Because you stopped listening. After your father died, I tried to reach out, but every time I brought it up, you walked away. You were hurting, and I didn't want to make it worse. So I stayed silent, thinking time would heal it. But silence only built walls between us. Daniel looked down, his shoulders heavy. The anger in him was melting into exhaustion. All those years, I blamed you for things that never happened. Ethan stepped closer, his voice gentle. Dad, she didn't just lose Grandpa. She lost you too. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Margaret smiled weakly at her grandson. He's right. We've all been carrying pain that doesn't belong to us anymore. Daniel sank into a chair, running a hand over his face. I was so angry at you, Mom. Angry that you never fought back when I accused you. Angry that you just accepted it. Margaret sat across from him. Because I understood where that anger came from. You loved your father so deeply. Losing him broke something inside you. I saw it happen. Daniel's eyes softened. He was my hero. When I thought you'd betrayed him, I couldn't forgive you, but I was wrong. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was peaceful. The storm outside began to fade, and sunlight peeked through the gray clouds. Margaret looked out the window and smiled faintly. Your father used to say storms always pass, no matter how fierce they seem. Daniel gave a small, sad smile. He was right. Ethan leaned against the counter, relief washing over him. For the first time in years, he saw his father and grandmother talking, really talking. The weight that had hung over their family for so long was finally lifting. Then Margaret rose slowly and walked to a small wooden box on the shelf. She opened it and took out a faded photograph, one of Thomas holding a baby Daniel in his arms, smiling proudly. She handed it to her son. He adored you from the moment you were born. Don't let a misunderstanding erase that. Daniel took the photo, his hands trembling. I've missed him every day. Margaret nodded. So have I. But he'd want us to keep living, to forgive each other. Ethan walked to them, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. Grandpa wouldn't want you to fighting. He'd want us together again. Daniel looked at his son, then back at his mother. Emotions swelled in his chest. Slowly, he reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. For the years I stayed away. For the things I said. Margaret's tears fell freely now, but they were tears of peace. You have nothing to apologize for, my boy. We both lost our way, but you came back. That's all that matters. Ethan smiled, feeling something deep within him settle, a sense of belonging, of home. They talked for hours after that. About old memories, about Thomas, about Ethan's future. Daniel admitted he'd been hard on his son, too strict, too distant. Ethan promised to return to school and give things another try. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Healing rarely happened all at once, but this was the beginning. Later that evening, after dinner, Daniel stood by the door preparing to leave. "I'll come by again this weekend," he said softly. "Maybe we can go through some of Dad's old things together." Oh, Margaret smiled warmly. "I'd like that." When he left, the house felt lighter. Not empty, but full of quiet peace. Ethan turned to his grandmother. "You did it, Grandma." "You finally told him." She smiled, wiping away a tear. "No, Ethan, we did it. You were the bridge between us. Your grandfather would be proud." He hugged her tightly, whispering, "I'm proud too." As the night settled in, they sat together on the porch, watching the last bit of sunset fade into the horizon. The garden glistened from the rain, the roses shining softly under the golden light. Margaret thought of Thomas, of his laughter, steady hands, his gentle patience. For years, she had carried the pain of losing him, believing her family had fallen apart forever. But now, watching her grandson and thinking of her son, she realized that love never truly disappears. It changes, it bends, it hides behind hurt and silence, but it never dies. Ethan broke the quiet. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, smiling. "Do you ever get scared of being alone?" She looked out at the garden, her voice soft but certain. "Sometimes. But I've learned something. Being alone isn't the same as being unloved. People leave, time passes, but love, it finds its way back, always." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding. That night, after Ethan went to bed, Margaret sat in her kitchen again, the same place where everything had started. The rain had stopped completely now. She poured herself a cup of tea and opened the window. The air was cool and fresh. On the table lay the old letter, now unfolded and worn. She picked it up, reading the words she'd written decades ago. They no longer hurt. They no longer carried fear. Instead, they felt like a bridge between past and present, between what was lost and what was found. She folded it carefully and placed it back in the box beside Thomas's photograph. "We're okay now," she whispered softly, as if speaking to him. "You can rest easy." Outside, the moon rose above the trees, casting a gentle silver light through the window. For the first time in years, Margaret felt at peace. The kitchen was quiet, but in her heart, it felt full of memories, forgiveness, and love that had survived everything. And as she turned off the lights and walked to her room, she smiled to herself, thinking of the knock that had started it all, a simple knock that brought her family back together.